There are growing calls for NSFAS to urgently resolve its administrative issues, which have led to scores of beneficiaries without a roof over their heads. Some landlords have evicted students due to non-payment of accommodation fees. Last month, NSFAS said it had made its first bulk payment at the end of last month, and the second one was due this month. For reaction on the story, I'm joined by Asive Dlanjwa, South African Union of Student spokesperson. Asive, good to speak to you. Obviously, this is worrying. Can you provide for us an overview of the current situation regarding students' evictions due to those delayed NSFAS payments?
Good evening to you, Hugo, your viewers and your listeners, and thank you for having us once again. What we are dealing with is a crisis, and at a time that is rather unfortunate because this crisis would have obviously begun or heightened during a time where students were engaged in their mid-year examinations, which is absolutely unacceptable, number one. Number two, what is happening is that you've got a few types of students. The first students are students that are living in accommodations which are under the NSFAS pilot program, where NSFAS sought to centralize the student accommodation, as it were. Now, what is happening is that some of those students, the landlords are claiming that they have not received their payments, and as such are evicting those students. The second type of students that we are having are also NSFAS beneficiaries, but they are not necessarily within the pilot program, and they were supposed to receive, those landlords, their monies from those respective institutions in which those students are registered. Those institutions have not paid that accommodate those monies to those landlords. And as a matter of fact, the landlords have resorted to evicting some of these students. So those are broadly the two types of students. And then the third category would be students who are NSFAS beneficiaries but went to live in student accommodations that were not necessarily accredited within institutions that are engaged in the pilot program. And so there's not a database of these accommodations. But what is clear amongst this whole situation is that there seems to be a failure and an inability from the side of NSFAS to be able to ensure that after all is said and done, all its beneficiaries have a roof over their heads and that they're able to participate adequately in teaching and learning. And that is where the crux of the matter is.
Asive, how widespread is this issue? Do you have an estimate of the number of students that have been affected?
It's difficult to estimate because, as I've said, for instance, there are various categories of students. And also landlords, and the system has not yet been able to be standardized across the country and across for all beneficiaries to know exactly how many have received payment, how many have not received payment, etc. But what we know for a fact, based on the reports that we are getting, is that it would be thousands of students across the country in various institutions, including in universities and colleges. But the exact number, I would not be able to give it to you, but what is clear is that we are sitting seemingly with thousands of students. In fact, what we also know for a fact, and this is why also it would be difficult to estimate, is because we know only of the students of this crisis sometimes only when the students have been evicted. But the reality is that we know for a fact that it is thousands of students. Some of them have not yet been evicted, but they're getting threats of eviction because because the landlords are claiming not to receive their monies on time. So as I say, it would be very difficult to estimate, but we know that a huge number, a sizable number of NSFAS beneficiaries are going through this crisis.
Asive, you obviously represent these students. Now, what has the response been from the students themselves who have been evicted? I mean, how are they coping, especially during exam period, as you mentioned earlier?
You can imagine, Hugo, it is a devastating period. The exams and the academic project in itself is one that is strenuous, it's one that requires maximum attention, maximum energy, maximum a focus from the students. So you can imagine when in winter, and it is cold with cold fronts across the country, that you are attempting to engage yourself adequately in teaching and learning and study for your exams. And then when you get back from the library, as some students have experience, you find your things sitting outside, lingering outside, and you have a paper tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you do not know where you are going to sleep that particular day. So you can imagine the devastation, and some of them, on top of that, they have not necessarily received also even their allowances that would allow them also to buy food and whatever other necessities to ensure that they can adequately participate in teaching and learning. So it has been a devastating period that has been underpinned and underlined by gross human right violations, because it is a human right violation. You're infringing on the basic human rights of the students when they do not have food, nor do they have a roof over their head. And these are people that obviously appreciate as students that are supposed to be supported by the state. So it has been a very devastating period. And the experience generally would be as I've explained, but in terms of the details, it will obviously vary from student to student and the extent to which institutions are able to respond. Because also what this calls for is agile institutions that are also caring, that are able to bridge the gap and respond within this time, particularly institutions that have residences or space where they can, on an ad hoc, house these students. But what we find is that, regrettably, majority of institutions are not committed to that human project to be able to interface and ensure that they are able to blunt the experience or the tragedy that the students that they are facing.
Now, what specific issues have you identified with the NSFAS's new direct payment system that are causing these delays?
NSFAS, we are going to say this every time we are here. If you are looking for an organization that specializes in incompetence, you must go to NSFAS. You will find some of the most incompetent people there. It's almost as if they were hired on the basis of their uselessness and incompetence, number one. And we have been decrying that. The minister himself decried that. The previous leadership itself decried that. But there seems to be no resolve and commitment to capacitate NSFAS with credible and competent staff, number one. And number two, it would appear that the administration itself of this accommodation program is not being done in a manner that is the most effective, to the extent to which you have service providers that that's the other thing that at NSFAS that they have a fascination about, is having always middlemen. Every time we say to them, do things directly, engage directly with students, for some strange reason, they will go and hire some of the most incompetent service providers to be middlemen. That's the other situation we're facing with this accommodation, because they have hired middlemen who are seemingly failing to be able to navigate the space and ensure that there is seamless communication and seamless processes between students, institutions, and NSFAS. So that is the other crisis that is there.
Now, very, very quickly, are there any temporary solutions that have been provided to the students? Are you, as a body that represents the students, been making any efforts to negotiate on their behalf, or is this something out of your hands?
That's why there's an administration. Sorry, Hugo, can you please repeat that? I was cut for a few seconds there.
Asive, obviously, as the organisation that represents students, have you made any efforts to protect the students, to negotiate with landlords on their behalf, or is this all out of your hands?
Look, without exaggerating ourselves, to the large extent, it is out of our hands. These are multi-billion rand transactions that are not being made. It's not like we have $1 billion up our sleeves. In terms of negotiating with landlords, we are doing that but you see, you must understand that it is not out of the thousands of students, not all students have access to us, and even if they did, we would not necessarily have inherently the capacity to engage all landlords across the country. Would not have the time, the energy, or even the money to do that. So those that have been able to reach us, we have been able to try to be able to do that. We've also been engaging with some SRCs and some institutions to say they must carry on to negotiate with the landlords and ensure that the students are assisted. We are on an ongoing engagement with NSFAS to try and understand some of these issues. We are receiving the same commitments that NSFAS has been putting out its statements, but unfortunately, after all is said and done, at the cold face and at the receiving end of the stick, is that students, thousands of students, are finding themselves left without accommodation, and some of them without money for food, etc., while they're engaged in examinations. So we are intervening to the extent to which we reasonably can, but ultimately what you need is that NSFAS needs to step up its game. NSFAS must be held accountable, and more than anything, NSFAS must get rid of that dead weight, which is the majority of the people that work at NSFAS.
Asive Dlanjwa, South African Union of Students spokesperson. Appreciate time. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Urge you to stick around and listen to our next conversation as we speak to Freeman and Nomvalo, administrator at NSFAS.